Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So my name is Lisa Dazzell, and I'm here with Michelle Castel and Tiffany Dangleben, and we're presenting on mentorship experiences of Black women in higher education, and it's a multi-autoethnographic study. So before we begin, we want to tell you a little bit about who we are. My name is Lisa Dazzell, like I mentioned earlier. I'm a third-year graduate student in the Counseling Psychology PhD program at Iowa State University, and I identify as a ardent qualitative researcher, a passionate Africana Studies instructor, and an academic activist. And my life work is focused on centering, empowering, and uplifting Black people in the fight for Black liberation.
Hi everyone. So as Lisa said, my name is Michelle. I graduated from CUNY Lehman College with a BA in psychology and a minor in French. I am a lecturer, researcher, and a strong advocate for Black immigrants' access to culturally adaptive language services, equitable healthcare, and quality mental health services. Additionally, I am devoted to serving the Black community with a focus on Haitian immigrants. Through my work, I will highlight how societally marginalized identities influence the socio-political and emotional development of Haitian immigrants.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiffany Dangleben, and I'm a third year school psychology doctoral student at North Carolina State University. My research identifies and combats disparities specific to African American families of children with autism, as well as educational inequities for all children in the K through 12 public school system. My life goal is to better the quality of life and educational experiences for all children as promised by the US law. I also teach a psychology course to which I incorporate mental health practices into my lectures. So, mentorship. Within this study, we utilized and modified the definition of mentorship from the 2014 Allen and Butler study. So, we define mentorship as the process by which an individual of superior rank, special achievements, and prestige instructs, counsels, guides, and facilitates the intellectual or career development of someone else. Specifically, we examine how mentorship has been facilitated amongst three Black women in higher education.
So why it matters. Black women are comprised Black women comprise 70.4% of total Black graduate enrollment, according to the US DOE. So, Black women earned 64% of the degrees that were awarded to all Black students in 2018, which makes Black women the most formally educated group of all races, in addition to within their racial group. So, Black women are commonly first generation students and must navigate the intersections of their race, gender, and academic related issues on their own. So, you can imagine that that's a lot to navigate and a lot of challenges that Black women endure because, as we know, institutions which are founded in white supremacy and Eurocentrism are not intended to help Black women navigate smoothly throughout higher education. So, Black women must navigate new territory, but often lack guidance and preparation, which affect their degree attainment.
Using the search terms mentoring, Black women, and higher education, these were the dominant results. I'm sure these studies are very impactful and important. However, the results demonstrate that there is a lack of literature surrounding the work that we'll be discussing today. Additionally, we had difficulty identifying literature that spoke to mentoring African American girls and women who are in undergraduate programs. The available literature we found on Black undergraduate students and mentoring are inclusive of Black undergraduate males, is from the perspective of the faculty, or is specific to a cross racial mentorship relationship. Therefore, they were excluded from today's literature review. Although this discovery is disparaging, it highlights the importance of our research. So what happens when mentorship is not available? Walkington 2017 presented a critical overview of the sociological research on Black women's experiences as graduate students and faculty in higher education. She examined both quantitative and qualitative articles dating back to 1995. We isolated the information Walkington provided that specifically pertained to mentoring Black women undergraduate students. Within their literature review, Walkington notes that Black women graduate students in the STEM fields tend to drop out of school partly due to a lack of faculty mentoring and feelings of isolation. Walkington highlights four strategies Black women graduate students utilize in their resilience. One, they search for faculty of color outside of their departments who understand the unique challenges and experiences they face for mentoring. Two, they draw on their expertise to contribute to scholarship in which they see themselves and work with and encourage each other. Three, Black women graduate students resist isolation and marginalization from their peers through space making. Here, some Black women graduate students who have been intentionally left out of dialogues and study sessions from their peers report that they simply show up, making a space for themselves. And four, some Black women graduate students report that they formed academic posses comprised of Black women graduate students across their campuses who experience similar challenges in their own departments.
So now we're going to jump into some of the literature that we did find about the benefits of mentorship. So as we previously mentioned, the Allen and Butler study. So they focused on the issue of the lack of representation because there are few Black women faculty members. So this is what they found. And they found that the benefits to mentorship is that it promotes the development of social capital. It helps mentees acquire socialization skills in white spaces, and it helps build resistance to exclusionary barriers in white spaces. Um, and so they also, so I wanted to describe the study a little bit. They utilized an elaborated theory building approach to analyze existing literature regarding mentorship between African American women, senior and junior faculty. So this study, it highlights a number of issues African American faculty can face within their intersectional identities within a predominantly white learning institution. So, and the study also discusses the benefits of a successful mentor-mentee relationship. And as I stated here, these are some of the benefits that they found. And they also created a model of what successful mentorship looks like for African American women faculty. And that model is called the model of co-ethnic mentorship. And in that model, within the general model of co-ethnic mentorship, it is understood that when there is a lack of or no shared experiences between a mentor and mentee, there will be negative or unfavorable policy outcomes for the mentee. While conversely, when there are shared experiences, or at least the consciousness of shared experiences exist between the mentors and mentees, the policy outcomes will likely be positive, or outcomes that are favorable to the mentee.
Next, Rasheed and colleagues in 2018 interviewed 38 Black women in doctoral programs to examine their mentorship experiences. So like Tiffany talked about earlier, the literature has actually been scant when solely focusing on Black women. In fact, they focused on Black men, as Michelle talked about, Black faculty, but Rasheed and colleagues 2018 actually focused on Black women specifically. And what they found were four important themes. So the first theme is that 90% of Black women that they interviewed had informal mentors or an informal mentorship experience. And this goes back to what Tiffany was talking about in terms of Walkington 2017's article, which was talking about how Black women tend to seek out those mentorship opportunities. Next, shared identity and interest. So like Michelle was talking about from Allen and Butler's study, women really need to have that shared identity, or at least the conscious idea of that shared experience. And when you do have that, it helps to promote and facilitate that personal growth and personal transformation. And so, what Rasheed and colleagues also found was the personal transformation piece that was inherent in these mentorship experiences. So, mentors played such crucial roles in allowing mentees to develop their personal and professional goals and growth. Next, having a mentor also increased access and opportunities. So, as you can imagine, when navigating these very isolating or Eurocentric spaces, it can be difficult for Black women who hold several multidimensional identities to feel comfortable in these spaces and to actually receive the opportunities, access, and resources that they really need. And mentorship is one way for Black women to feel supported in these very isolating spaces. So, as we've talked about, while previous literature has examined Black women's mentorship experiences and provided suggestions for mentoring Black women, it has not focused on what mentorship experiences were unhelpful for Black women. In addition, we really didn't find many studies that were solely focusing on Black women and their experiences, and then using those experiences to create helpful and unhelpful themes as well as suggestions. Even though we know that mentorship plays a significant role in Black women's educational advancement. So, of course, it's important to highlight what was helpful, but it's also important to highlight what was unhelpful so that individuals are aware of how to approach Black women and some things that can be very, very harmful, because obviously we want Black women to be thriving and succeeding in higher education.
So for our methodology, we created research questions that we use to provide suggestions for mentoring Black women that, based on our themes. So our research questions are as follows: how have Black women experienced mentorship in higher education? What mentorship strategies have been helpful or unhelpful for Black women in higher education? So we used a multi-autoethnographic method, and this is a form of qualitative research in which authors use self-reflection and writing to explore anecdotal and personal experiences to connect their autobiographical story to wider cultural, political, and social meaning. And so for our procedure, we developed a series of interview questions that we use to create our reflective essays. And these were our questions. Throughout your life, what identities have been salient to you? What mentorship experiences have you had? And what has been helpful throughout mentoring and what has not? And lastly, if you were to reimagine your mentorship experience, what would it look like for you? So we coded our reflective essays to develop themes. For our first round of coding, we identified individual themes within our own essays. For our second round, we identified and discussed commonalities and differences throughout each of our essays. And lastly, for our last round, we engaged in collective meaning making to establish core themes of what was helpful, unhelpful, and suggestions for future mentorship experiences.
To expand a little bit on what Michelle was talking about and how we were able to code, we also used Richardson's validity tactics, which focused on 3 points. The first being reflexivity, the second being impactfulness. So does this affect me emotionally and or intellectually? Does it generate new questions or move me to action? And the third being expressing a reality. So, does this text embody a fleshed out sense of lived experience? Additionally, due to our usage of prompts, we engaged in thematic coding, which Michelle talked about a little bit with the rounds. So, as described by Rossman and Rallis, 2012, coding is a process of extracting segments of writing, like sentences or paragraphs, and putting them into categories. Coded categories are often labeled using terms by the participant. And thematic coding, which is often referred to as thematic analysis, is a qualitative analytic strategy that can be used to assess themes that are of importance to the research questions. So the themes that we came up with are important to the initial questions that we asked ourselves. The themes identified in the study were guided initially by our prompts. We also used Gibbs's suggestions in his 2007 article on qualitative reliability procedures. We cross-checked codes by entering into an intercoder agreement, which is a when two or more researchers come together, Michelle, Lisa, and I, and agree on codes that are being used for the passages within the text.
So, based on what Michelle and Tiffany said, we created reflective essays. And so, we wanted to provide you all with some quotes from our reflective essays to highlight just what we were putting into these essays. And so, periodically, we're going to show you some slides with some quotes on it. And we're going to leave you about 30 seconds or so for you to read it yourself. So after writing the reflective essays, we got together, like Tiffany mentioned, in order to have that intercoder agreement. And so we talked about our commonalities and our differences. So this is that reflexivity piece that Tiffany also mentioned earlier, where we reflected on our own biases, or not even biases, more of what subjective realities we're bringing to the work. And so I'm going to go over this in order to let you all know our situated standpoints and where we were coming from into the work. So, starting with Michelle. Michelle was born and raised in the Bronx, and she's a Haitian American, and she's also multilingual. Next, with myself, I was raised in Queens, New York City. I'm the second to last of five. I come from a single parent household. I'm an academic activist, a researcher, and I hold my BA in Africana Studies. Next, Michelle and I both share a low socioeconomic status background. Next, with Tiffany. Tiffany was raised in Westchester. She is a middle class woman. She's a caretaker, friend, and a leader. Both Tiffany and I share the immigrant status. We're both immigrant women. Michelle and Tiffany both come from a nuclear family. They're the eldest of two, and they're both advocates. Next, with our similarities, how we all merge together. So we all are Black. As you can see, we're daughters and sisters. We have a Christian upbringing. We're first generation students. We are all educators, and we've all been mentored, and we've all been mentees, and we all hold a background in higher education with our BA in psychology. So a little bit about our mentorship experiences. So for me, mentorship started, I would say, really early in high school. So I was mentored by one of my track coaches, and then it developed over the time, specifically with that academic mentorship from undergraduate. So I received mentorship, academic mentorship from Black mentors and white mentors. So there was a mix and some differences in identities as well. And my mentorship experiences have transformed throughout the years. And currently, I'm being mentored in my graduate program by my advisor, who doesn't share my same identities.
So for me, educators served as informal mentors for me throughout my throughout my education. More of a so this happened mostly within the academic sphere, right? And I didn't have formal mentors until really after I received my undergraduate degree. So for the most part, I never really had that direct conversation on choosing a mentor formally and navigating that process. And I did find as well that I've had a mix of mentors, but as of late, my mentors do not share the same identity that I do. So that has, yeah, for the most part, that sums up the most salient experiences of my mentorship.
I share similar sentiments. I've been mentored since high school, both informally and formally, by Black males, Black women, white women. But my most salient mentorship experiences have been my, I guess, formal and informal mentorship in graduate school, where I was able to receive guidance, academically, career wise, professionally, and how to navigate, white spaces, which is new for me. Um, and that's the sum up of my mentorship experience.
Okay, so after writing our reflective essays and then coming together to determine what the commonalities and differences of our respective backgrounds are, we also identified very salient, helpful mentorship themes that we've experienced. So, some helpful aspects of mentorship have been when one, our mentors value us as humans, they value our humanness. And so, some examples of that is getting to know us beyond academia and seeing us as multidimensional human beings. So it's no surprise that when individuals are students, they're also potentially someone's daughter, brother, sister, friend, etc. There's so many roles that graduate students play aside from just being students. And so it's so important to see graduate students outside of this one box and view them as multidimensional beings. And especially when you're talking about Black women who are often pigeonholed into this one unidimensional identity. But it's so important when mentors value our whole humanness. Next, emotional support was so important. And this involves showing compassion, validating our experiences, and displaying active and passive listening. So, actually taking the time to show up for your mentor and your mentee and sitting with them, being a compassionate human being to another human being. Next, resources. So when we were presented with opportunities based on our interests and our passions, and when our mentors shared their knowledge with us, those type of resources are fundamental. And it goes back to the previous literature that we also talked about with Walkington, with Allen and Butler, with Rasheed, 2018, where Black women gained so much from mentorship experiences because they were allowed to have that professional development. And that, of course, comes through receiving those resources that your mentor has access to. There's also teaching, providing explanations, and providing your knowledge for professional development, as opposed to just micromanaging or doing things for your mentor or mentee. Next is support. So while all of these things can be seen as a source of support, we isolated support because we wanted to include that open and honest discussion and also providing advice and encouragement along the way. So being in higher education is not an easy task, especially when you're first generation, especially when you're Black, especially when you're woman, because frankly, these institutions were not created for us. And therefore, they just will be more inherently more challenging for us because it wasn't created with our identities in mind, which is why support is one of those important things. And like Tiffany talked about in her own experiences as well of mentorship, it was important having that advice and encouragement when navigating these predominantly white spaces, which we often find ourselves in higher education. So, as we mentioned, something that we found that the previous literature really lacked was identifying what the unhelpful mentorship themes were. So, while they talked about helpful themes and they provided suggestions, they really didn't get into the nitty gritty of what was unhelpful. And I think we all know that it's important to really consider what Black women need instead of just being like, oh, here's a mentor, they'll help you out. No, we need to also consider fit, and we need to also consider things that have been unhelpful for us. And so, in our reflective essays, we took the time to actually reflect on what was unhelpful. And we identified 5 themes. So the first is when mentors had a dissimilar identity. And while we highlighted as an example dissimilar racial/ethnic backgrounds, other backgrounds might also create dissonance or distance between mentor and mentees. For instance, higher education is patriarchal. And when you have men who have more power and you're a woman entering these spaces, it's also important to talk about those different identities as well, because it for sure will impact your experience. Also, inaccessibility. So, when there were difficulty arranging meeting times, and we don't mean the little slights in scheduling, we're talking about when there's delayed feedback, when meetings are rushed, when they're interrupted, or when you just don't feel like a priority, and this is your mentor. Next, there's the lack of autonomy. So this goes back to that teaching component that was helpful. Was also unhelpful is when mentors complete tasks for us, or when they expect that we'll complete tasks in their way. So that micromanaging component really doesn't work. We want the opportunity to do for ourselves and learn for ourselves as well, with the support and with the guidance. So that goes into the next component, the next theme of lack of guidance and support. So when we were expected to just know things which were never explained to us, which goes back to that quote, how do you know what you don't know? You don't. And so when you just send mentees out into the world and you're like, oh, go figure out how to do a literature review, or go connect with XXX. And they have no way of doing that, or they have no idea of how to do that because maybe they've never done it before, and they're learning, right? It's difficult not having that guidance and support that's like, oh, this is how you do this. I'll send you an example. I'll show you how to do it. Also, inadequate networking preparation. I think we can all agree that a lot of higher education is networking. That's why people come to conferences. That's why people try to make friends and communicate, etc., because that networking component is super important. And so when you don't have the preparation of how to navigate these networking spaces or relationships, it becomes very difficult and potentially anxiety provoking. Also, when there's a lack of advocacy. So, as we've talked about all throughout this presentation, institutions were not meant for Black women. Therefore, you can imagine that the policies that are inherent within the institutions are not intended to support Black women the way they'll support other people. And so, as a mentor, especially in predominantly white spaces, it's super important for us to be advocated for. Like, while we can advocate for ourselves, yes, that's true, self-determination, etc., we are also powerless within these institutions when we are a student. Although we hold some forms of power, we don't have the same power that mentors might have. And so using your power in order to assist us is helpful. Next, belittlement and harm. So we actually spent quite some time on this because this was lengthy. And I think, as you can see visually, that is representative of how unhelpful belittlement and harm, which obviously hearing that, is unhelpful. And so we're going to go into some examples of that. So when we felt disrespected or our boundaries were crossed, that really didn't promote any safety in the relationship. And in addition to that, that body policing, commenting on our hairs, our bodies, our looks, and making disparaging remarks against us and who we are. Also, undermining our hard work, disregarding our efforts, and dismissing us as individuals. That really facilitates that lack of respect and makes us feel less than in an institution that already does that. Also, yelling at us, making us feel like we're a burden or an inconvenience. That also goes back to that inaccessibility piece. If your mentor doesn't want to meet with you or finds all of these excuses to not meet with you, that really makes you feel like you're not their priority, or like you're an inconvenience or a burden. Also, having low expectations for us. That, like, no one wants to be navigating in a space where they already have low expectations, and then their mentor, who's supposed to be supporting and guiding them and be advising them, who also has low expectations, and you can feel it, and that doesn't help. Next, ignoring or overlooking concerns, right? So ignoring us or ignoring blatant jarring concerns, and not guiding us or helping us through that. Also, breaking confidentiality. So, for instance, if we share something with a mentor that we think will remain confidential and then they share with other people in the form of gossiping or cruel and harsh tactics where they're sharing your information, that's really, really hurtful, especially when you've trusted someone. Also, comparison, like comparing us to other students or individuals who might not even be on the same track as us and trying to fit us into a mold that really does not fit our own experience or our passions or our interests. So now moving on to some suggestions. So like we talked about helpful mentorship aspects, unhelpful mentorship aspects, and naturally that comes with suggestions of how to improve. So we're not just going to leave you hanging. So first, we suggest having sensitivity and awareness to your mentees' multidimensional identities. So we're Black, we're woman, we're student, we're daughter, we're sister, we're friend, XXXXX. So it's important to really take into consideration these identities, especially when making suggestions, because you're not going to tell everyone the same kind of suggestion. And maybe mentorship for different people, well, always mentorship for different people looks different because you're tailoring that to the individual. Also, the emotional support component, listening, valuing this person who's sitting across from you, showing that compassion. Also, valuing mentee humanness. And I feel like this goes hand in hand with the multidimensional piece, because if you respect that no one exists within a vacuum, specifically Black women do not exist in a vacuum, even if they're showing up in front of you as a student and as a mentee, there's so many other things going on. And you can imagine because the same is true for you. And so, valuing that humanness is will be so important and it'll be felt. Also, providing resources. We can't do this alone. We need resources. We need people to talk to. We need information. We need opportunities that we can apply to that will bolster our professional development and our personal and professional growth. Also, showing respect and care. That shouldn't be hard, but unfortunately it is. And so, really thinking about the ways that you show up in spaces and how you sit in front of other people and the compassion and care that you show for others. Also, advocating, like we talked about, these predominantly white institutions really don't have our back. And so, as a mentor, it's important that we have our students' backs or you have your students' backs because the institution won't. And we need to feel that support. And also, we need to be advocated for because we'll do it for ourselves, but it's also important when people in charge and people in power also do it. Next, teach and provide guidance. A big part of mentorship is teaching and it's guiding and it's having patience in order to teach and to guide and to help us when we don't know things because we won't, especially since we're learning and this is our role as a learner to learn. Um, Next, be available and be present. So be accessible. And no one's saying like 24/9, but in the spaces when you're supposed to be present and be available and show up and show that you care and show that you care about the person that's sitting across from you. Next, encourage autonomy. Allow your mentee to learn, to engage in the process of learning. Yes, they will mess up, and that's also okay because that's a process involved in learning. But it's easier to mess up when you know that you have support to fall back on and people who won't shame you for engaging in the learning process, which naturally involves messing up. Also, establish boundaries with your mentees. I think that this is one of the most important ways that you can set how you want your mentorship experience to look with your mentee. And this involves having those conversations with what boundaries do you have? How do you want this mentorship space to look? And cultivating and creating what the mentorship experience can be. And that can be so profound because you can meet even semester by semester or yearly in order to go over, is the way our mentorship is working for you? Is it working for me? What can we tweak? What can we change? What has been helpful? What hasn't been helpful? But setting those mentorship boundaries from the beginning can help to clarify so, so much. If you find yourself stuck and you're like, I don't know what this person wants or needs, maybe it's time to have a conversation about what's helpful, what's not helpful, and what boundaries should be set in place. Also, create a trusting relationship. So all of the things that we've listed will no doubt help you to create a trusting relationship. But it's not like you just do this and you check mark your box. This is a continuous effort. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of time, and it takes you really being available and present. And I would argue that, you want to have that trusting relationship, start building that rapport from early. And you can do that, like again, I said, with the boundaries. And setting those boundaries in order to start to create a trusting relationship. Don't just expect that Black women will come into an institution that wasn't built for them, trusting actors that are in the institution. That's not the way things work, or maybe it does. But also, in order to maintain that trust, if it's already there, you need to be doing a lot of these things. Okay, so that's where we'll stop. We have created some discussion questions because we want to get to know you all a little bit.